heavy and a tough beginning to your sessions, and particularly on a Saturday morning. But anyway, that's what you've asked me to do. So I want to say something about terrorism and what we, the man or the woman in the street, can do about it. Now, it's something I've spent more than a decade thinking about as a member of the Youth Justice Board for England and Wales. That's the body that oversees the criminal justice system for those who are under the age of 18. As a member of a cross-government board on preventing violent extremism, as it was called under the previous government, counter-terrorism is called under the present government, which brings together people like myself, along with MI6, MI5, the police, and so on. And also as a parish priest in the inner city, and as a lecturer in religious studies. So all those seem to come together for me. Now, in these British Isles, we've lived with terrorism and the threat of terrorism for over 40 years. Political terrorism in the form of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and more recently, religious terrorism in the shape of an extreme version of political Islam. So I want to ask the question, are there lessons that we can take from the experience of political terrorism that can help us in overcoming this new religious variant? I'll look first at political, then at religious terrorism, and as I do, I'll try to make it clear what I think the ordinary citizen, people like ourselves, can do to make our cities safer places. First, a working definition of terrorism. Unfortunately, in the academic literature, if you look through that, there are currently over 100 definitions of terrorism. So I'm simply going to give you my own working version. Terrorism: attempts to terrify principally civilian populations with acts of extreme violence as a means of bringing pressure to bear on those in authority. So attempts to terrify principally civilians in order to, through extreme violence, in order to bring pressure to bear on those in authority. Let me begin then with political terrorism, and I'll talk principally about the terrorism of the provisional IRA and what we learned from that. It's important, though, to remind ourselves that one reason why terrorism still has its allure for many people is because it doesn't always fail. It sometimes works. For example, the terror campaign by Zionist Jews, the Sternberg gang, against the British in Palestine was a factor, perhaps even a big factor, in eventually persuading the British to withdraw from Palestine and to bring about the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So terrorism sometimes succeeds in achieving its objectives. So what have we learned from the struggle against the IRA that's of permanent value? Let me mention three things. First, we've learned that terrorist atrocities are not to be understood as mindless criminal acts or the work of people with psychotic personalities or mental disorders, though there may be some terrorists who fit that description. But we've learned not to think of terrorism in that way. That was what we first thought. It's how the popular press often reported. But Britain's political leadership eventually recognised that the terrorist acts of the IRA were a form of violent politics. As such, that required a political as well as a police or an army response. And that was a very crucial insight, and it took a while to get there. Secondly, defeating political terrorism did also mean defeating it militarily. The IRA's bombing campaign was designed to destabilise Northern Ireland and make it ungovernable, as a first step towards creating, out of that chaos, a united Republican Ireland. Bringing the IRA to the point where they realised that they would not succeed through violence involved capturing and convicting perpetrators and disrupting the bombers' cells and their supply chains. Defeat didn't mean eliminating the organisation and all its members entirely. Defeat, though, did mean seriously degrading its capabilities to the point where both the leadership and its supporters realised that violence would not achieve their objectives. Now, bringing them to that point, the point of realisation, also depended on those who opposed the IRA being very resolute and extremely courageous. This included ordinary citizens, service personnel, police, army and intelligence, and political leaders in both the province and on the mainland. And some of those political leaders, like the Reverend Dr. Ian Paisley, lived for years with the possibility of assassination hanging over them and their families. The British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, came within a whisker of being killed when the Brighton hotel where she was staying for a party conference was bombed in 1984, and the MP Airy Neave, we know, paid with his life. Third, defeating the IRA required the draining of active support and passive sympathy for them from the nationalist population north and south of the border. And that was done by patiently making the point over and over again that the IRA's political objective, the incorporation of Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic, could only be achieved by overriding the wishes of the majority of people in Ulster. In other words, even if it were achieved through violence, it would leave a majority in the north permanently disaffected and communities even more bitterly divided. So the problem of a divided community would not be solved by incorporating the 6 counties into the Irish Republic, but only intensified. A negotiated political solution with give and take and compromise was the only way forward. Now, while we were confronting the IRA in this country, on the continent, Germany had another form of political terrorism to deal with, the Baader-Meinhof group, or the Red Army faction. The Red Army faction was a group of anti-capitalists. Like the IRA, defeating them involved catching and convicting the leadership and the main perpetrators of violence. It also involved overcoming the sympathy that many young Germans, the post-war baby boomer generation, had for their cause. These young adults felt revulsion at the way so many former Nazis had been allowed to resume their careers in the military, in the civil service, in industry, politics, after the war. 1 in 4 of the German younger generation told opinion pollsters that they were prepared to shelter terrorists on the run from the police. So support for the Baader-Meinhof group had to be weakened by showing that their ultimate goal, overthrowing world capitalism, would produce economic anarchy that would benefit no one, least of all the ordinary citizen. And that was a political, not a police task. And it involved ordinary citizens saying to their family and their friends in ordinary conversations that the Red Army faction's goal was absurd and its methods abominable. The defeat of Irish terrorism, which was always political and never religious, even though perhaps the majority of supporters were from the nationalist and Catholic minority in Ulster, it was really essentially a political project. That required then a multifaceted approach: military defeat, public education, and finally political dialogue with them. And that was something which, to its very great credit, the government of, first of all, Prime Minister John Major and then Tony Blair understood completely. Which raises the question of whether defeat of Islamic terrorism will have to follow a similar trajectory. Before answering that, let me introduce one further idea that's controversial, but I think it'll enable us to understand how people who, in all other respects, seem no different from their fellow citizens can nevertheless overcome moral scruples and kill other human beings. I mean, that's at the heart of this thing, and that's a major issue to try and get our heads round. How is it that quite ordinary people, not mentally deranged people now, those with pathological personality of one sort or another. How is it that they can be persuaded to overcome all their human instincts, their scruples, moral scruples, and kill other people? I want to suggest that terrorist violence, their actions with a deeply moral purpose, or rather from within the distorted moral framework of the terrorist, what he or she does is something that seems morally totally justified. The end they want to see is deemed so important that it justifies all or any means of getting there. It trumps any consideration of the damage that's done to other innocent human beings. Indeed, even the very idea of innocence can be overcome. Everyone, apart from the perpetrator and those who think like him, is complicit in propping up a corrupt system that must be swept away. Of course, from the moral perspective of most people, what I've called the morality of the terrorist is utterly abhorrent. But terrorists operate from within a moral framework of their own devising, expressed in a coherent narrative, and we must seek to understand that if we're to refute it. This is why it's not helpful to look for answers to terrorism in terms of some mental disorder within the terrorists themselves, though, as I say, some may be mentally disordered. That's what the purpose of the trial at the moment of Anders Breivik is trying to determine whether he is mentally ill or not, and psychiatrists seem to be divided. One of the striking features of Islamic terrorists in both Britain and across the world has been their normality. They're often husbands and fathers with jobs and careers. They can be well educated and well off. And like Mohammed Sadiq Khan, a popular teaching assistant, the leader of the London bombers, they're not lacking either in imagination or empathy. The strength of their narrative about their ultimate goal is what allows them to suppress imagination and overcome empathy. And then they're prepared to risk everything because of that religious narrative. 4 things, I think, are essential if Islamic terrorism is to be defeated. First, just as political terrorism requires a political response, so religious terrorism requires a religious response. Islamic terrorism is best understood as a form of violent religious politics. But there are different types of what I'll call Islamism, that is, forms of violent extremism that appeal to the idea of jihad or holy war. Some are more political in their goals than others and more achievable. Some are more religious and their goals less achievable. It's essential, therefore, that we understand the religious narrative, the specific religious narrative that motivates the terrorist. These different narratives are about God's intentions for the world and human society, about some desirable alternative to the political settlements we currently have, and a justification of violent action, jihad, as a punishment or as a catalyst for change. And these narratives are critical in both drawing people towards violence and justifying them in the use of violence. And understanding the narrative and its power, therefore, is always a necessary first step for all of us in defeating terrorism. Some narratives make reference to political objectives that are achievable. Once it's clear to Islamists of this type that they will not achieve their goals by violence, dialogue then becomes possible. It's conceivable that there could one day be dialogue with, say, the Taliban, because they have some realizable political goals. More difficult, though not wholly inconceivable, would be an eventual dialogue with Hamas in Gaza, which is also religiously inspired. Their ultimate political objective, a one-state solution brought about by the total destruction of the State of Israel, is unrealistic. It's fantasy. But once they come to accept that this can't be achieved through campaigns of violence, minds will then turn to feasible solutions and dialogue becomes possible. And a modus vivendi with Israel, i.e. a two-state solution, is not impossible to envisage. Some in the Hamas leadership will reach that position sooner than others. I doubt whether many have reached it yet, and the general population may also begin to simply weary of perpetual violence, as the Irish did. However, a word of caution here, the Palestinians have been educated to accept the role of perpetual victim, not least by Western liberals, including many Christians, and this often acts as a brake on political progress. One way we can make a difference is to refrain from encouraging this idea, which we do whenever we say, I can understand why they resort to violence. Now that's heard as support for their terrorist activity. So we must never say anything that even hints that terrorism might be morally acceptable. But there are other forms of Islamic terrorism, such as Al-Qaeda and its various offshoots, where the ultimate political religious goal lies in the realm of pure fantasy. This is the idea that the world must become one vast Islamic state, submitting to Sharia law and under the ultimate guidance of a caliphate. Each aspect of that utopian dream breaks down under scrutiny, not least because it wishes away the existence of millions of people, including other Muslims, who simply don't share it and would indeed resist it. It survives as a dream only because it's not subjected to close analysis, especially by fellow Muslims. We should not be shying away from discussing these objectives and submitting them to this intense examination. We should also be helping younger generations in plural societies, such as our own here in the United Kingdom, to understand why democratic forms of government are best fitted to ease the tensions caused by people with different religious and political views having to live together on the same soil. So first then, defeating religious terrorism requires a religious and not just a military or political response. Second, if we want to defeat terrorism, we need to accept that those drawn to violence are not necessarily psychopathological personalities, but normal people who are able to overcome revulsion at killing because of the moral power of their religious narrative. And here there's a challenge to Islamic scholars, because Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is a religion of the book. In fact, the Quran in Islam has an even more exalted position than the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian Bible. In Islam, the Quran occupies the place that Christ does in Christianity. It is God's word. It is his very speech. Although it comes through the prophet, Muhammad does not contribute anything to it. He simply recites what he hears. He's like a pen in the hand of Allah. And when Muslims hear the Quran recited, they're hearing the accents of God himself. And so the written text is very important indeed. This was brought home to me many years ago when I was a young curate and in my first job, being invited to the mosque to meet the new imam, which I was very happy to do. He's from Pakistan. He could speak no English. He was brought over to this country because he was one of those rare people who could recite the Quran by heart from beginning to end. And he had a beautiful, mellifluous voice. So we sat down in a circle in the mosque and I was introduced to him. And they said, would you like to hear him recite the Quran, which I said I would. And this young man began, just recited by heart. And 2.5 hours later, he was still reciting by heart, at which point I had to very awkwardly excuse myself and go. But the old men who sat round in the circle listening to this had tears pouring down their face because they were hearing the voice of God himself. That's the way in which the Muslim hears the Quran. Even so, texts need interpreting and they need applying in particular situations. And it's crucial, therefore, that Quranic scholars in the West, elsewhere, but certainly in the West, take the controversial texts about jihad and the use of force against non-believers and help Muslims understand them, especially the context in which they were originally spoken. And if that vital work is not done, then the way is left open to the men of violence to frame an Islamic narrative that's text-based and carries, therefore, considerable authority for pious believers. There is a need for authoritative, widely available, simply written pamphlets and books that deal with the issue of jihad and help Muslims to understand that inner jihad, the inner struggle against self-centeredness, is the primary focus of Islamic piety, and self-generated and self-justifying violence are abhorrent to the mind of God. But that's a religious work that needs to be done. Third, if we're to defeat religious terrorism, as with the IRA, Islamic terrorism is more likely to be perpetuated if some generalized sympathy for the cause of violent jihad continues to be generated in the wider Muslim community. That community has come a long way in this country and elsewhere since 9/11 and 7/7. At first, many ordinary Muslims found it impossible to believe that the attack on the Twin Towers in New York and the bombs on the London transport system were the work of Muslims, and lots of conspiracy theories abound. There are still those who live in denial about that, but they're fewer. Gradually, there's been an acceptance that there is a problem that has a religious root, and that the prime responsibility for dealing with that lies in the Muslim community itself. And then finally, fourthly, religious terrorism is underpinned by a narrative that has to be challenged by a robust alternative, part religious, part political. What especially needs to be tackled is this. Absolutely central to Islam is the idea of Tawhid, oneness, the oneness of God and his world. And the temptation for some Muslims, as it has been a temptation for Christians and others in the past, the temptation for some is to think that a plural world, a world of many faiths and many cultures, is against God's will. And the attempt to bring everyone under Sharia, if necessary by jihad, accords with his will. Again, this is a fantasy, an unreality of a non-plural world. It needs pointing out. Human beings will always see things differently from one another. Islam itself is a witness to that because it's internally divided. Sunni, Shia, Sufi forms, as well as different schools of jurisprudence. And there are those Quranic texts that recognize the inevitability of pluralism. Surah 5:48, for instance, to each among you we have prescribed a law and an open way, to each among you. If Allah had so willed, he would have made you a single people. If he'd so willed, he would have made you a single people, but you're not a single people. At the same time, the democratic political narrative needs to be constantly reiterated and affirmed by all of us. The ability to change the government through elections, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, tolerance of minorities, and so on. And moreover, we need to be clear that while these elements of the democratic society may first have been stumbled on in the West, they have a universal application. Democracy is compatible with any religion. It's the best way the human community has found to enable different and competing groups to live together in relative peace. And that democratic narrative needs to be well taught in schools, citizenship, RE, history classes, with opportunity for discussion and no shying away from the hard questions raised by the Islamists and their very different narrative. So let me draw all this to a conclusion and sum up. My main arguments have been these. The contribution we can make as the man and woman in the street is first to seek to understand what we're dealing with. Acts of terror are not mindless, nor are they to be explained as the work of those who are mentally deranged or in the grip of evil. From within a particular moral framework, these acts of violence are deeply moral. And if we're to overcome religious violence, we must understand and refute the religious narratives by which the people of violence live, because they enable them to set aside accepted moral scruples and commit their terrible deeds with clear consciences. And we must have better narratives, including better religious narratives, that insist that the Islamist idea of world domination is fantasy, illusion, that the world is and always will be plural, and that democracy is the best means of managing plurality, allowing those of different faiths and none to live relatively harmoniously together. And wherever we can, we must do all this together, in interfaith groups, in political parties, socially, because that in itself witnesses to the better way.
The main thrust of my discussion today is that we are going to empower our young people to change the world. And I'm hoping that in the years to come, that every district will have a peace officer if they don't already have one. I was being trained in Hanover, and we were being told all about the wonderful work that Rotary does with our Peace Fellows. And as you do at some of these conferences, and I'm sure that one or two of you, I'm hoping, won't do it in my discussion, but I'm sure you possibly will, you drift off. And that's what I did, I drifted. And I started to think about what else could our Peace Fellows do? Rotary pays for them, and it's fantastic, and they go all over the world, but what do they do in our country? What could they do while they were being trained to work with some of our youngsters? And it was from that idea that this all actually evolved. My work of 58 schools across Scotland showed me that there's a clear evidence of problems developing with our young people. They don't have the capacity or the knowledge to know how to solve a problem. I noticed it just in playgrounds. A child accidentally bumps into another child, it's not an accident. It's turned around, you did that on purpose. There is no question today that there is an accident happening. Our youngsters are not brought up in this way anymore. Litigation has a lot to answer for. And unfortunately, our youngsters are learning this from a very early age. Even in my own school, there was no such thing as a lost pencil case, it had always been stolen. And this really led me to believe that there is clear evidence of problems developing, because our youngsters do not know how to solve a problem. They do not have the skills to know what to do, except to blame someone else. And I think it's time that we as Rotarians stood up. 55,000 Rotarians across Great Britain and Ireland. Look at the expertise in this room alone. What are we going to do about equipping our youngsters with the skills to ensure that they can make decisions correctly? We can do it. We have. This is our age coming in now. It's actually being profitable for us for once. We can do something about it. And that's where we're starting from at this point, is what Rotarians can do. Service above self. It's not rattling cans, it's not costing a lot of money, but it is service above self. So, Peace Jam UK. Take note of the word. You might want to go on the website and have a look at it. It operates from Bradford. The directors of Peace Jam are 12 Nobel Peace Laureates. They are the ones that have got together, and it's Desmond Tutu, the Dalai Lama, Aung San Suu Kyi, Betty Williams, Escobar, who is there this weekend. These laureates got together and decided that they would put together a skills-based curriculum using the skills that they used when they were trying to work through their problems. And this is what they have put together for use in schools. So what I'm asking is that Rotarians take this curriculum and are trained by me, because I am a trainer now for Peace Jam, to go and work in the schools with the youngsters to develop the skills for peace and conflict resolution. It's the Peace Ambassador curriculum that I'm using. It's working with what we would call the top end of the school. I think in England that would be maybe lower 6th and upper 6th. In Scotland it's S5 and S6. And I go in once a week. Mine work in a lunchtime. They finish their school, they go and get their lunch, they bring it to me, we have a Peace Jam meeting, and they go back to school. I can't ask for more than that. They want to do it, they want to be empowered, they want to work. The curriculum looks at the skills, and it looks at things like, how do we listen? What's our body language when we're talking about? What's the questions we should be asking? How do we actually give conversation and dialogue appropriately to get our opinions heard? Because unfortunately, when we were saying earlier, they don't know how to do this. And that's often when the violence kicks in, because they don't know how else they can be listened to. So if we can develop skills with them of, this is the way you react, this is how you ask it, this is your body language that you use, this is your facial expression, they might, hopefully, be listened to. And certainly just recently, my group, I said that something had come up and I said, well, I'll go and speak to the rector. The rector in Scotland is the head teacher of a secondary school. We call them rectors. And I said, I'll go and speak to the rector. And straight away, 2 of them said, no, we'll go. We know what we want to say. We know how to say it. We'll go and talk with the rector. Which was fantastic, because they were actually using the skills that we had been talking about. The other chapters in the Peace Jam curriculum, actually there's 3 other chapters, there's 5 chapters altogether, one dealing with skills of how you do it and how you mediate and things like this, and the 3 chapters on why people do, which is very much what our previous speaker was just saying there, Anne, why people do what they do, why they react in the way they do, why they react violently, what's caused it. There's 3 chapters looking at that. Peace and violence, bias, prejudice, all of these things are looked at in depth. And the final chapter is a service chapter, where it encourages youngsters to look at what is suitable, what is a need in their community or in their school, and how they could go about it. My group are looking at cyberbullying, because for them in their school, that is a big problem. We believe that it is our youngsters who will create peace, not us. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, I'm sure of it. But if I can start it, and the target is that every secondary school in Great Britain and Ireland will have a peace jam in it, run by Rotary. Hopefully Rotarians will be acting more as a mentor as time goes on. But to begin with, we have to deliver the skills.
We believe we can do good in the world on this programme if we could educate more people in the broadest sense, not only academically, but also in terms of interpersonal relationships, etc. And to the point where today it is the largest educational programme in the world.
I am grateful to have been an ambassador or a scholar. As David demonstrated, it really is an incredible program, unmatched in so many ways. What makes this program unique is that it is not just a scholarship. It necessarily involves interaction with the community in which you are studying, and greater interaction with the community from where you've come. It's not just about money. Any foundation can give money. This is about connecting. We rebuild, we reaffirm peace by forging connections with one another, at work, at school, with neighbors, with strangers. The path to sustainable, meaningful peace is not imposed from above, but is brought about by bringing people together in very real, very personal ways. This is how we have peace at home, and this is how we can have peace abroad. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Rotary also helps by supporting one of the newer Rotary-sponsored educational programmes and put forward candidates for the Rotary Peace Centres for International Studies in Peace and Conflict Resolution. Rotary Peace Fellows are leaders promoting national and international cooperation, peace and the successful resolution of conflict throughout their lives, in their careers and through service activities. Fellows can either earn master's degree in international relations, public administration, sustainable development, peace studies, conflict resolution, or a related field, or a professional development certificate in peace and conflict resolution.
I was able to go with a group of international journalists to bring out the story of Laos, which is the most cluster bombed country in the world. There are 80 million cluster bombs that are still live there since the Vietnam War, that go off at the rate of about one a week, either injuring or killing a child or an adult working in their fields. There are dangers to this line of work. Obviously, when we're out in the field, it's a lot different from being in a classroom environment where you're talking about theoretical conflict resolution. There are severe burnout and psychological issues with dealing with some of these issues. Personally, I deal with the victims of human rights abuses all the time, and that can take its toll. There are also physical risks. The benefits of the program by far completely outweigh any of the dangers or risks that we face. As Tristan talked about before, the connections that you make are absolutely crucial to building this kind of international career. And a couple of opportunities to do that have been international symposia that Rotary has put together, where they bring current and former Peace Fellows together in one place to basically network and talk about in a public forum what they're doing. And one of those is coming up next week in Bangkok, which I've been very privileged to be invited to.
One of the bits of information that's just a little statement that's not been said, which always sticks in my mind, was that at the time of the world-changing events of September 2001, Rotary was the only non-governmental organisation developing courses in peace and conflict resolution. And there is one central figure connected with us who was a leader, if not at times the leader, of the Developing Peace Centres programme. And that's a guy called Bill Huntley. Bill was the fourth from these shores to be the president of Rotary International, and he was a leader, and much has been said very recently at Buenos Aires. It was at the 2000 RI convention in Buenos Aires when Bill Huntley announced to the world the commencement of the Rotary Peace Centres programme.
The idea and the ideal of human rights is one of the most compelling ideas of human history. It's the most compelling idea in human history, I think, because it's a fundamental challenge to the idea of absolute power. It would be the simplest thing in the world to write a history of humanity which was nothing but war and bloodshed. You know, rapacity, cruelty and violence. Many histories are. But there's a counter-history. And it's the history of religious, political, philosophical and spiritual traditions from time immemorial into the present, which keep asking the question, how shall we live? How shall we live together? What's the proper basis for organizing relations between communities? Once someone understands that she has human rights, her understanding of her place in the world and the nature of her relatedness to everything else changes profoundly. It's only an idea. Equity is related to sustainability. And it's not just a fact of stability. I mean, many of the Arab regimes that have fallen in the last few years were very stable. But the quality of that stability, as we heard from other speakers, was really under question. And so, in thinking about the human condition, whether your passion is for, bottom up, top down, for the dispossessed, for the global environment, for whatever it might be, I think we've got to deal with these interlinked themes: equity, stability, and sustainability. Please be assured that whatever you want to do in the way of peace, then your work will find you. If you're sitting there thinking, oh, peace studies sounds great, but you know what? I really want to study medieval history. I really want to be a mechanical engineer. Psychology is really my thing. Like, please do that. Please follow your hearts. You know, if you're not going to follow your heart at 18, 19, when your energy's at its highest, your imagination's at best, your passions are inflamed, and you've got the fewest responsibilities, when will you? And you are surrounded, by way of inspiration, by Rotarians. These are mostly men and women who've made their lives in professional jobs that, although not directly related to peace, still did not abstract from trying to do good in the world. You're in really good company here. These are the people who have stitched across their hearts service of the self. That's very, very powerful. Live as best you can. Live according to your conscience, but do enjoy your life too. You know, there's more to be done through through steady, mundane, everyday work, such as Rotarians throughout the world do, as there is in the great heroic stuff to be done in refugee camps. Whatever your work, when it comes knocking, when you hear the call, I hope you'll be alert and responsive. Thanks for your time.
And if you have an opportunity to work with Rotary, take it. Rotarians are people who care about making the world a better place, and I think that's been made clear here today. They have the knowledge and experience that they're happy to share, and they're your biggest cheerleaders. They want you to succeed, and they want you to make the world a better place too.
I am a great respecter of Rotary, and I was asking myself earlier today what it is that draws me back for a second time to talk with you. And I think it's the fact that the Rotarians that I've had the chance to meet all put other people and other people's needs above their own. They call it service before self. And the great thing about Rotarians is they decide to do something and they do it. And I'm a great fan of that.
Newham is a borough of London that is very rife with gang crime, specifically very, very either with guns or with knives. That's the two main ones, but just generally very, very gang related. And in addition to that, it's also quite a poor borough. So we need to find a way to actually get young people off the streets doing something else. And that's what Trees 2020 is. It's a group that is involved with peace building. And what we try and do is within 10 weeks, we give them a course and we teach them theoretical and practical knowledge of conflict resolution and facilitation of workshops. And they learn many different skills. First of all, the main thing we try and teach them is to look at conflict in a different way. Look at it in a way that is already thinking about resolution rather than attacking. And the way that we do that is respond, not to react. And the idea is twofold. Firstly, to get people from other countries to come and speak to these youths who are experiencing conflict themselves and have a sort of a likeness in feeling. You have someone in southern Sudan, the other side of the world, and they are experiencing a similar conflict, similar feeling of danger to their lives. So if they're able to come over and speak to these young people about it, it gives a sense of what they're doing and what we're training them to do is going to have an effect, just like it has an effect in elsewhere in the world. And the second reason we do that is to show them that after they finish this 10-week program, that's just the beginning, that's just the basics, the foundation. And after they finish that, they can then go on and do their own peace building, which is what these people from different places are doing.